Are books just too long? Yeah, probably. This is something I find myself thinking about and getting progressively more and more annoyed about as time goes on. For context, I've been working as a book critic now for about 6 years, both as a YouTuber and as a writer. And before that, I was a high school English teacher. And while I kind of cut my teeth on fantasy books and never noticed, paid any attention to, or gave a shit about the length of those books, these days, after having read thousands and thousands of novels, I'm kind of at the point where I really think books are just too long, unjustifiably long. So I'm going to have a conversation with myself about this, and you can watch and listen and disagree if you'd like to. Now, I have to say up front that this is a complicated topic that probably doesn't have a right answer. I have an answer of my own, doesn't mean it's the right one. My answer is that yes, books are too long. But I guess the full statement there is that books are just too long for me these days. See, like I said, I used to read a lot of fantasy fiction, and it wasn't that I consciously enjoyed the fact that these were long novels, so much as that I just genuinely didn't notice. I spent so much of my teenage years playing lengthy RPGs, getting lost in these big, expansive, open fantasy worlds, and often replaying those games in order to fall back into their worlds and their stories. And so when I started reading for pleasure, fantasy books were the things I gravitated towards because I'd grown up on fantasy TV shows, films, and video games. And fantasy is a genre known for its lengthy stories. No one bats an eye when a fantasy novel is 600, 700, 800 pages long, and part of a series of books that are all at least 500 pages long. It's normal. And I never cared, I never thought about it. Now I do. Which begs the question, why do we read? We all read for different reasons, and I don't read for just one reason. There are lots of reasons to read a lot of books. And that's why I'm talking here about novels, because I kind of have to give non-fiction a pass. There are so many history books out there, for example, that are absolutely enormous. But if a person has spent years or even decades researching a specific time period within a specific place, it's going to be long, it's going to be detailed. And so it should be. You don't want to skimp on anything. But when it comes to novels, I'm a lot less forgiving these days when it comes to length. And I think that's because when it comes to fiction, we often read to be entertained, but that's kind of a nebulous and vague thing. When we say entertained, we might mean escapism. And in that sense, a long fantasy epic is a great thing. But what if you read to be emotionally moved, to feel empathetically connected to someone or something, to a theme, an idea, or just a character? That is so often the case for me. It applies to historical fiction, literary fiction, and even horror. The emotional connection and the emotional impact of the story is what I really adore these days. And so I don't need my books to be overly long. And I think that's why so much literary fiction, really thematically smart fiction that has something to say politically, is often pretty short. So many of the great literary novels are like 200 pages long. They have a theme that they want to explore, and they do so through really well-written characters. And often not a lot happens in the plot, but you feel so moved. You feel so connected to these people, and your mind is on fire with ideas. The themes have pierced your soul. And all of that can be done in 100 to 200 pages. And so when I find myself caring so much about characters and themes and ideas, and also concepts when it comes to horror and science fiction, the idea of a lengthy story is lost on me these days. Books are too fucking long. But like I keep saying, it really depends on the kind of book and what you want out of it. For me, almost all books are too long. And the thing that inspired me to make this video in the first place is Butter by Asuko Yuzuki. This is a very smart Japanese literary thriller. I've talked about it quite a lot recently. I did a video on it that you can go watch. But Butter stands shoulder to shoulder to so many other great Japanese feminist literary novels. And all of them are a lot shorter than this. Butter is unjustifiably long. It is full of fat that should have been cut. It wastes your time. It does not respect the reader at all, and it pissed me off. Butter could so easily be compared to the works of Sayaka Murata. Convenience Store Woman is an astonishingly clever piece of fiction. Thematically dense, very critical of our modern-day conservative capitalist world, led by a character with incredible personal depth, a character you will connect to in so many different ways for so many reasons. A book full of enormous ideas that really encourages your empathy. And it's 150 pages long. And it was followed up by Earthlings, an even more radical, shocking, upsetting, distressing book that follows a lot of the same ideas, but adds loads of discomfort and a tinge of horror. And it's 250 pages. Many Japanese authors like Sayaka Murata know how to write captivating short fiction that hits you over the head with its emotional weight and presents smart social and political themes that get your cogs turning for months or years after you've read them. And then there's Butter, a book that does all of that, kind of, but so much of it is just lost in the density of the thing. This book is nearly 500 pages long, and it should have been 200 pages long max. I am upset about this book, and I will continue to be upset about it for ages, because I was so hyped for this thing. And there is definitely a good book in here somewhere, if only it had been literally half the length. A really interesting case study for this is Susanna Clarke. Her second novel, Piranesi, is one of the most universally beloved stories. People adore this novel, I love this novel, it's incredible, it's flawless, it's perfect. And like I said, I'm not alone in thinking so. Everyone loves Piranesi. 250 pages. Her first novel was Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. 1,000 pages. Is that justifiable? Yes and no, and it depends who you ask. I read this book at a time when the length of a novel didn't bother me. And I enjoyed the characters, I enjoyed the adventure they went on, I enjoyed the setting, blah blah blah, that's all great. If I read it now, I would absolutely think that so much could have been cut out. And I think that's really interesting because so much of this, as I'm speaking here, clearly reflects who I am and where I am in my life right now. As well as my career as a critic, I want to read lots of books. I want to review them, talk about them, promote them, blah blah blah. If they're long, that gets in my way. But it does go deeper than that, because Piranesi to me is a more memorable novel. Even though I did read this quite a few years ago, I really don't remember this novel. I remember everything about Piranesi, and I do think it's a more emotionally intelligent novel as well. A novel that demonstrates an enormous amount of growth in the writer. So even if I didn't mind the length of this novel at the time when I read it, does that mean the length is justified? That's such a big question. If a reader doesn't notice or mind the length of a book, is the length justified? I honestly don't know. As someone who reviews and talks about books for a living, my biggest point here is that a book doesn't ever have to be as long as it is. Not a single word or page was wasted in Piranesi. This is a perfectly crafted, finely chiseled piece of fiction, an absolute work of art. But when a book is as long as Jonathan Strange is, so much perfection feels kind of lost in the mists of the book. It's hard to pin down where all of the cleverness is when there's just so much stuff. But when you cut a novel down, when you trim all the fat away, you're left with this pure core that is just delicious, just so admirable. Now I, like probably everyone else in the world right now, recently rewatched Denis Villeneuve's Dune Part 1 and then went out to the cinema and watched Dune Part 2. And that, of course, has put me in the mood to reread Frank Herbert's Dune. I never read the other books in the series and now I really want to. But I'm going to start by rereading Dune as soon as possible. But what's putting me off is the length, because I read this book a good few years ago now. And what I specifically remember annoying me about this book was the fact that there's a lot of walking around. Again, unjustifiable walking around. Dune is a masterpiece of epic science fiction. There is no doubt about that. So many people are making really good essay-length videos about this right now. The political and religious themes of Dune are incredible. The world building is magical. I am utterly amazed by Frank Herbert's world, and I'm really excited to reread the original novel. But it's gonna be too long. There is going to be too much walking around. Could Frank Herbert have delivered what he delivered in terms of its world building, its character writing, its thematic depth, and its emotional impact, even if he cut out like 100 pages from this book? Yes. And that is so often the case. When an author has something in mind that they want to present to the audience, which is often a character or a relationship, or a theme, and all of these are presented in an interesting world. Why can't that all be done with fewer words and pages? I think the answer is that it can, and I think Dune should have been shorter. Here are two books that I read within the last year that I absolutely adored. I loved both of these books so much. I called Babel by R.F. Kuang a masterpiece, and I stand by that. Clytemnestra by Costanza Casati is the best Greek mythology retelling I have ever read, and it's a debut novel. I love Greek Greek mythology retellings. They are everywhere right now and I eat them all up. And this for me is the best. But they're both too long. This especially has a middle part that really drags, where nothing really happens, and it is not justifiable. That's the thing I keep saying here, is that these books do not justify their length. Clytemnestra is almost flawless as Greek mythology retellings go, but there is a lot of repetition in here when it comes to the characters, where over and over again, Casati reminds us of how the characters are feeling, what their current emotional state is. There's a lot of treading water in this book, as if Casati wasn't confident enough in her own writing to trust that the audience understood how her characters were feeling at all times, and so she kind of reminds us when she doesn't have to. Both of these books could have had at least 50 pages cut from them. In the case of Babel, probably 100 pages. 450 pages instead of 550 would have done wonders for this novel. It would have picked up the pace, it would have cut out all the plodding, and nothing would have been lost in terms of its delivery, its emotional impact, its tone, its pacing. It all would have been enhanced, if anything. Because when a book has something very important to say politically, as Babel does, filling it with fluff is going to water down those themes, as was the case with Butter. Butter is a brilliant feminist novel, full of fat, full of needless fluff, that waters down what the author was trying to say. And it's such a shame. Clytemnestra is incredible. It is 450 pages, and I would have loved it even more if it had been, say, 350. Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez is another example of this. This was my favourite novel of 2022. A true masterpiece of political Argentinian horror fiction. A really, really incredible work of art. It's also over 700 pages long, and it's kind of 3 novels. This thing really has a 3-act structure, where the tone and arguably even the genre shifts as it goes. And I have to wonder how much could have been cut to maintain the political thematic impact of this book. Now, Our Share of Night is an interesting one because it's a really complex thing. This is a book of big ideas. It is so politically smart and intriguing, and I loved every aspect of it. But if you separate it into its 3 acts and examine each of those acts, you will be able to find so much fat that could have been cut. If each of those 3 acts had been cut by, say, a quarter of their length, once again, nothing would have been lost. And this 700+ page book could have been reduced to, say, 500 pages, which is still long, still longer than I like books to be these days, but it would have tightened everything up. A huge issue that I have with long books is pacing. If a book is too long, the pacing is destroyed. But to argue against myself here, that's not always a problem, and again I refer to fantasy books. Sometimes when a book is really, really long, that's a lovely thing. When a book has a really slow, plodding pace, that can be a lovely thing too. You can't see her, but my cat is stood just over here. And she's thinking about jumping on my head. See? What are you looking at? What was I saying? Pacing. If an author has created a world that is incredibly rich and vibrant, and you simply enjoy your time in that world, you may never want it to end. The escapism is so immersive, and you so enjoy these characters and the world in which they live. You don't want to leave, you don't mind the pacing, and you're happy to just go along on this adventure. I mean, I've definitely been there. I said as much at the beginning. And in that sense, books can never be too long, and I would not take that away from anyone. But recently I've been surrounded by so many books, and no matter how much I've enjoyed them, and I've enjoyed a lot of them, one of the big criticisms I always have is that the book could have been shorter. And I think this is the point that I'm going to land on here, is that if an author is clearly setting out to deliver on a particular set of themes and maybe political or religious ideas, if they are trying to tell the story of a character's journey or their relationships, and if they can do all of that and still emotionally connect with the audience on a really deep and satisfying level, and do it all with fewer words than we currently have, then they should have. If I read a book that I connect with, that emotionally exhausts me, that draws me in, and makes me feel so much love and joy, excitement, heartbreak, anger, frustration, whatever, but all of that still could have been done with fewer pages, it should have been done. If you can deliver on your themes and ideas with fewer words without losing those themes, you should. Every author owes it to their audience to deliver everything they set out to deliver through their art with a more focused and concise amount of words. I think that's where I land on all this. What do you think, Mary? Do you think you're the most adorable, cute, beautiful thing in the whole wide world? She does. She is. I've talked for a while here and I could keep going with more and more examples that are all piled up around me. But like I said at the beginning, there is no definitive answer here. There is no right answer. I just know that as a professional critic, I keep coming up against books that are unjustifiably long, that did not need to be. And when a book is under 300 pages long and feels as though it is changing my world and it didn't need extra room and time to do that, it didn't waste my time doing it, that book is a masterpiece. And the more of the reader's time a book wastes, the more it waters down its own impact. And that is heartbreaking. I really thought this was going to be a short 10-minute rant, but actually I have so much more to say about this and I could keep talking. I still think books are too long, but also looking back on my reading journey and thinking about the reasons why so many big epic books are big and epic, I have found more sympathy for longer books as I've been talking. All that said, they're still too long. Subscribe for books.